Wasabi guys, coming back at y'all with another top 10 video. This time we are going to be looking at the top 10 best Rakdos colored cards in the Commander format. Now if you're unfamiliar with my videos, I tend to do these lists for multiplayer Commander. So if I don't actually state that this is for dual Commander 1v1, just assume that this is for the multiplayer format. Before I get into the actual top 10 list, let's go over some awesome honorable mentions. These are pretty decent cards that I thought were worth noting, but they just didn't make the top 10. First one we have here is Rakdos Return, a very popular card when it comes to Rakdos colored decks, things like that. However, in the multiplayer format, this is going to make you a huge target. It's going to make you an enemy. And while I'm not totally against it in a multiplayer game, to me it just doesn't really help the political aspect. Staying in the game, surviving longer when you make an obvious enemy out of yourself. Pretty good if you're just all into discard and you have discard triggers, things like that, to synergize with it, but dealing X damage to them and forcing them to discard X cards, that is just brutal and pretty much torture. Next one is Ready Ingenious Iconoclast. I actually really like this guy in Brea. I think he's pretty solid. I like his minus, being able to sacrifice an artifact to hit either a creature or an artifact for removal. That's pretty good. His ult is also pretty decent. I mean, you get to choose an artifact either in the graveyard or on the battlefield, and you get 3 token copies of it. That's pretty strong. However, in a lot of these same artifact decks, he kind of just doesn't really fit in, because Brea is about it. You do have the Mishra deck, which some people focus on artifact builds for him, but for the most part, a lot of these artifact decks are in Esper colors, in black and red. Even in the decks like Brea, you're typically going to be focusing on Tezzeret as your planeswalker of choice, and usually Tezzeret the Seeker, probably Tezzeret Agent of Bolas. Those are typically stronger planeswalkers for artifact-based decks, but still pretty solid. Then we have Mogis God of Slaughter. Pretty weak on its own. If you can just pile this onto whatever you're doing to force your opponents to lose life or sacrifice creatures, it can kind of help out, but on its own, it is very weak. And then the last one we have is Sark the Mad. Yet another very specific, narrow planeswalker. He works really well in dragon-based decks. You don't really see him that often, though. His minus is pretty solid. It can be removal for your opponent's creatures. However, if you are playing a dragon deck, you want to sacrifice one of your weaker creatures so that you can then replace it with a 5/5 dragon, which is awesome because his ult immediately after that is a -4, and you get to have each dragon you control deal damage equal to its power to target player, which that's a pretty nasty ult, because then you can just swing in with all those dragons and likely knock out that same player if you haven't already, or start attacking your other opponents. Very strong planeswalker in those decks. Now we go into the actual list here. Number 10 is Master of Cruelties. Sees consistent play in Alesha decks as well as Kaalia decks. Very well known for just the obvious 1-2 punch with those commanders. Gets across the whole attack trigger, bring their life total down to 1, then the Alesha or Kaalia you're attacking with also is going to deal the final blow. Aside from that, though, the obvious weakness with him is that he just doesn't really do anything outside of those decks in this format. He's pretty easy to deal with. If you just play him, people are obviously going to gang up on you and get rid of him. Even if you do swing at players, you need to have something like a Rogue's Passage or a Whisper Silk Cloak attached to him to make him unblockable in order to actually connect, because he is First Strike Death Touch. That's chumpable. You're going to chump him all day, and he's likely just not going to get in for damage, really. Most players are just going to throw out random creatures just to block anyway, so he really just doesn't have any evasion built in, so that's his obvious weakness. You know, a 1/4 isn't fantastic stats, but he does have First Strike and Death Touch, so he's a pretty solid creature there. Just not a whole lot you can do with him, but in those 2 decks that I mentioned, Alesha and Kaalia, he is definitely a force to be reckoned with. Then number 9 is the Scorpion God. Now this might be a little bit too soon. Hasn't seen enough play in the format yet to be any higher on this list, but what we have in Rakdos already is a ton of Wither synergies. There's not too many, but it's enough to actually make it a thing. So when you can draw cards off of creatures dying with -1/-1 counters, that's pretty solid in these colors where you don't already have a ton of card draw. To have it consistently with a commander, same thing as with the Scarab God and the Locust God. Whenever he dies, you get to return him to your hand at the end step. So he's recurable, and he's a continuous problem, especially with the Hapatra deck. There are already a ton of -1/-1 counter synergies. It's just you need to brew, you need to take the time, explore the deck. I definitely think he's a strong option as a commander, but so far it just doesn't really seem like a lot of people are taking to him yet. maybe in the next few years when people start brewing and exploring for new commander options, this guy will come up more often. Maybe not as easy to go off with tokens as Hipatra is, but definitely an interesting premise for a commander, basically taking advantage of effects like Wither. You can even take advantage of persist creatures, your own ones dying, and getting to draw cards off of those is nice as well. So pretty solid. The activated ability is just a -1/-1 counter on a creature, so it's a little weak in this format, but still pretty solid. Number 8 is Grando Dungeon Warden. Pretty popular as one of the 99 and Alesha decks because he does have 2 power and toughness. However, he also works out pretty well in that same deck for another reason, and that's a lot of your creatures are going to be pretty weak, so if you could put a ton of +1/+1 counters on him, you actually are able to bring creatures from the bottom of your library to your graveyard. If that creature's power is less than the power of Grando, you get to put it into play. So what we have here is just a very unique commander option as well. There are some cards that synergize with the bottom of your library. There aren't too many of them, but you can just structure your deck around smaller creatures, a little bit more of an aggro build, which is what he's meant to be, and just take advantage of that. Very unique strategy, kind of out there. Not really something we see with other commander options. Usually we don't see a ton of cards that synergize with the bottom of libraries anyway. Usually it's the top of the library, so having this type of unique strategy, very similar to the Scorpion God, where it's a strategy that's almost so out there. It's even more out there than the Scorpion God, but definitely think we could see more cards that synergize with the bottom of the library in the future. I would like to see that, but definitely a very solid card in Alesha decks, as well as a pretty solid commander on his own. Number 7 is Olivia Valldaran. For a while, at least before Edgar Markov came around, she was well known for being one of, if not the best option for vampire tribal-based decks. And the obvious reason was that you can steal your opponent's creatures, turn them into vampires. She gets +1/+1 counters, and you can just essentially Memnarch for vampires, which is a pretty solid concept. However, beyond just the obvious vampire tribal synergy, she's also a pretty solid card as one of the 99 in, say, a Marchesa the Black Rose deck. If she dies with a +1/+1 counter on her, Marchesa can bring her back. So there's a pretty strong synergy there. And she's not really terrible as one of the 99 in a lot of decks in this format, because stealing creatures is always a strong thing. There's always strong creatures in this format. You have some Eldrazi's that you can ping for damage and take control of them, turn them into vampires, steal Annihilator type effects. That's pretty solid. Just a ton of awesome creatures, and being able to also turn them into vampires has its benefits as well. Just a very solid creature, and beyond just vampires, she's also pretty good. Number 6 is Sire of Insanity. This dude is just insane. If you want to play the super spiteful deck, if you want to play a pretty solid control deck, if you want to play aggro decks, anything where you want to make sure your opponents are denied all their resources so that they can't really do anything, and resource denial is already pretty strong in Commander, but taking away their hands at the end step, each player has to discard. So it's not just your end step, it's not just theirs, it's each end step. So each end step, if your opponents gain any advantage at all in terms of card draw, they have to discard that card at the end step. So cards like Rhystic Study lose their effectiveness if they don't get to keep all those cards. Cards like Necropotence don't really matter anymore because they have to discard those cards and they exile them. So pretty strong creature altogether. Doesn't see enough play in this format, I feel. The fear of slowing down the game, I mean, it's well worth it when you consider the fact that there's so many decks that just like to hoard their hand size, hold on to all these counter spells, all these removal spells, and in a super aggressive deck, if you don't have to worry about those instant speed removal spells, you're likely going to be able to swing in uncontested, swing in without worrying about any consequences. Very strong in Kaalia decks for a similar reason, as well as just strong in any aggressive black-red deck where you just don't want your opponents to cast spells in response to whatever you're doing. So very underrated for that aspect, but just a very powerful creature. Number 5 is Vile Smasher the Fierce. The commander option, so powerful that it got banned in 1v1. However, in multiplayer, he's just not as powerful, but the whole fact that you have a random selection of who's going to be dealt damage, that is very unique, and it's very political. I'm not a huge fan of him as a commander, but I definitely think he's interesting in this same type of spiteful decks, those chaos decks, in Rakdos colors, where it's more about just having fun. It's about spreading the damage around equally. No one really feels singled out with a commander like Vial Smasher. They just don't like getting dealt damage randomly. It's not always fun for your opponent, but when you consider you can just fill your deck with a ton of these overcosted spells, typically spells with Delve, gigantic spells, things like Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time, spells like that that are just insanely large in their total converted mana cost. They have cost reduction, so even if you end up only paying like 2 blue for a Dig Through Time or 1 blue for a Treasure Cruise, they're still getting dealt that 8 damage randomly. So a very strong option as a commander, but I like him just as much as one of the 99. If you want to play more of a control deck, if you want to play something like Nekasar the Mindraiser, I would highly recommend throwing him in there as one of the 99 as a supplementary creature, because it's always nice whenever you could just pile up on the damage. It's the same reason why I didn't put Mogis God of Slaughter on the list, because that's only why he's good. It's because he could just pile up on extra damage. But Vial Smasher can just provide all the damage you need, and a very competent little 3-drop creature. Number 4 is Kolaghan's Command. You get to choose 2 different options here at instant speed, and 3 of which are pretty decent. The first one and the third one are probably the best, because being able to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand and destroy an artifact is pretty strong in this format. Artifacts just dominate. Artifact decks are pretty popular, and creature recursion is better than just returning it to your hand, but when you can just bring it back to your hand, it's also pretty solid, in addition to also destroying an artifact's pretty nice. Forcing an opponent to discard a card is sometimes good. Situationally, it's better, but dealing 2 damage is rather weak compared to the other options, so the best part about it is obviously this first 2 that I mentioned, but all this in a 3 mana instant is just insanely good. So it's very strong when you can have versatile removal and just a multi-purpose card all around. Pretty solid. Number 3 is Rakdos, Lord of Riots. One of the most flavorful cards in Rakdos colors. I mean, the whole guild is named after Rakdos, so pretty strong as a commander. Also pretty solid as one of the 99 in some awesome Kaalia decks. The other version, Rakdos the Defiler, is pretty strong, but usually better as one of the 99, whereas Rakdos, Lord of Riots, what I really like doing with him though is throwing in a ton of Eldrazi into the deck, playing something like a Perforos, God of the Forge, or an Impact Tremors, so every time you get to play one of these gigantic creatures, they come into play, you're dealing more damage to them, and the cost reduction is just insane with Eldrazi's, because for the most part, they're all just generic mana and the converted mana cost, so you can just cast them for free pretty much. Just a very strong option as a commander, pretty solid as one of the 99. Only downside is you have to be able to deal damage first in order to get him out. However, that shouldn't be too hard. Usually in the decks that are designed to get him out are likely going to do a pretty solid job of that anyway. And in Kaalia decks, you really don't need to deal damage because it just puts him into play, tapped and attacking. It's not cast, so pretty easy to get around it. Number 2, we have Terminate. Maybe not the strongest card on this entire list, but one of the most played cards between these 2 colors, without a doubt, if not the most played. All it is essentially 2 mana in black and red to destroy a target creature. It can't be regenerated. At instant speed, this is pretty solid. It's not over the top. It's 2 mana to destroy a creature. We have this in the form of Doomblade. We have this in the form of Go for the Throat. Cards that can destroy creatures for just 2 mana. However, the fact that this could just destroy a creature with no other drawback, it doesn't have to be a specific type of creature, it doesn't have to be a non-artifact creature, it doesn't have to be non-black. The fact that it's just 2 mana, it's pretty solid, it's cheap, it's mana efficient, and it's also at instant speed, so you're capable of dealing with problems right when they happen, rather than having to wait on your turn to deal with them. That's always better. Pretty solid card. Sees a ton of play in this format. Definitely deserving of a high spot on this list. But it's not number 1 because number 1 is Rakdos Charm. Very strong, very underrated card. It should definitely see way more play than it already does. Forcing each creature to deal 1 damage to its controller is a win con. But this is definitely a safeguard against the super aggressive token strategy decks. Anything that wants to just get out of control. There's so many combos as well that win by getting tokens, such as Zealous Conscript's Kiki Jiki combo, based around just getting infinite tokens and just attacking at once. Well, you play this in response to them attacking. Each one of those Zealous Conscript's copies deals 1 damage to their controller, and you pretty much just knock them out of the game. Very fun safeguard. Is also capable of destroying an artifact as well. So in my honest opinion, it's better than Kolaghan's Command and Terminate because it has that versatility. And the other ability is also pretty solid in being able to exile all cards from a target player's graveyard. Just all three of these abilities are relevant in some way in this format, so the fact that this card doesn't see as much play as it should is quite alarming. Out of all of the charms, I would have to say that Rakdos Charm is probably the best because all three of the abilities are relevant in this format. You don't typically see this with the charms. You have some charms that deal with life loss, such as Boros Charm, which aren't terrible in Commander, but I mean 4 damage isn't fantastic either. So being able to shut down graveyard-based decks just by exiling them, essentially a Bazooka Bog, destroying an artifact, well, that's relevant always, and each creature dealing 1 damage to its controller is definitely a great win con that you can just tutor up, and I like cards that are situationally pretty good. Rakdos Charm always tends to rise to the occasion, just in my play experience. Overall, just a fantastic card. So anyway guys, that was my top 10 list for the best Rakdos colored cards on the Commander format. Let me know what your favorite Rakdos colored cards are. Let me know if there was a specific card that didn't make this list that you were curious about. Leave it in the comment section. You all have a wonderful day. Void here, signing off.